Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or a personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Emely Rumble. Emely is a licensed clinical social worker, a school social worker, and a psychotherapist of over 12 years. Emely received her BA in literature from Mount Holyoke College and her master's of social work from Smith College School for Social Work. Emely's professional interests are trauma-informed therapy, racial trauma recovery, bibliotherapy, poetry, therapy, and neurodivergent affirming therapy. Emely aims to educate people on the use of the creative arts in psychotherapy, mental well-being, and self-improvement, and works very hard to make mental health therapy and bibliotherapy in particular more accessible by integrating books into therapy. So Emely, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you so much for having me.
I gave a brief introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you better, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Yeah, well, your introduction was amazing. First of all, thank you for that. I think you pretty much knocked it out the park. I am a therapist in private practice in the Bronx, New York, and Bibliotherapy NYC is the name of my practice. And I use my platform to really educate on bibliotherapy in particular, but really the creative and expressive arts as modalities of mental health treatment. So I'm really excited to speak with you today. And I know you've got some good questions lined up, and I'm ready to jump into it.
All right, cool. Thank you for that. And first, I wanted to ask, what did mental health look like or not look like for you growing up? And how did that make reading appealing to you?
Yeah, so I grew up with my grandmother. My parents were teen parents. And so my maternal grandmother really was the one who raised me. And she was a God-fearing woman, a church-going woman, a Bible-reading woman. And so, growing up, it was always about centering God, centering that God can heal us, right? And that any issue that we have or ailment that we have, we take it to the Lord in prayer. And that was very much like the foundation of what I grew up learning and hearing. But then I would see the discrepancy between what I was hearing my grandmother teach me and hearing in the church, and then like actual life in my community. My maternal aunt was actually my babysitter, and she was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. And growing up with her, being so intimately connected to her was, I think, so much of what informed who I became as a therapist, because my aunt was very brilliant. She was not violent, but she did have many of the features of schizophrenia. So she would experience hallucinations, delusions. And so a lot of the time when I was left in her care, she would get these ideas of reference. Let's say we were watching television or listening to the radio. She would believe that these newscasters were speaking directly to her, and that, they're giving her messages. And in turn, she's telling me like, oh, Emely, there's about to be a tornado is coming, let's say. And we have to prevent the tornado from, hitting our city. And now we have like a list of things we have to do to prevent this from happening, right? And so as a kid, I know that that's like not the norm, but I also know that my aunt is unwell, and like I'm going to have to go along with this until my grandma gets home from work. And so I think in many ways, reading for me was an escape. It was a way for me to get the answers to questions that I had that nobody was like engaging with me around in honest ways. I was like 5, 6 years old looking for books that would reflect the reality of schizophrenia. I was like 7 when I first read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. There's some really adult themes in that memoir. And so I was always just looking to understand the things that I was seeing at home, in my community, in my environment, even in the church. There was like blatant mental illness, but nobody was like naming that. And so me being someone who was always like drawn to books, I was always a really strong reader since I was little. I would just, it was almost like going on a little mini adventure, like, let me find a way to make sense of this. And I would do that through reading. And also these little mini adventures that I would go on in books, I felt like I was going on with my aunt because she was clearly um, living a reality that was separate from mine. And I found myself being really curious about her inner world and like, okay, well, what's really going on? Because every time the pastor comes to pray for her, it's not helping. If anything, my aunt was very much like averse to being touched. And so my grandmother would be the one to lay hands on her. But I grew up seeing all of this and just trying to make sense of it. But I feel like that was like the early roots of my becoming a therapist and being really invested in mental health, especially in communities of color.
Thank you for sharing that. And it's funny that one thing that you mentioned was, even though your grandma and your aunt, your family was grounded in the church, that prayer and mental health didn't really intersect, because that was something that growing up for me too, everybody has a crazy uncle, or, who,
Yep.
who shows up at the family reunions or the barbecues or what have you. And there's never an answer for why he is the way he is. He's just like that. Right.
Exactly.
So being a kid, you're curious about, well, what can be done, or can he get better?
Yeah.
But that was something that no one wanted to touch, because mental health just wasn't a subject that we culturally, or, the family dynamic looked at, or even wanted to consider.
Yeah. And in our families, especially for those of us who grew up in the church, there's the sense that if we own up to just how much pain we're in, just how much we're truly suffering, and our mental health is suffering, then we're denying the power of God, right? And so we have an additional barrier because we've told ourselves that our seeking out mental health support is contrary to being someone who's God fearing, and we would never do that.
I literally just wrote something a couple of days ago about spiritual bypass, because
Yeah.
of how damaging it can be, and how it's not a reflection of a true inner world, or just reality in general. It's just glossing over so many things that we know aren't right, and so
Right.
many people that are not well, just because.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
all right. I want to get into what you specialize in, which is bibliotherapy. And we talked a little bit about that. And I mentioned that I thought it was so dope that you are a therapist integrating books and literature into healing and mental health. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about what it is you do and explain what bibliotherapy is.
Yeah, well, bibliotherapy is the use of books to heal, essentially. And it doesn't just have to be books, it can be stories, any form of storytelling media, but it's really the incorporation of stories and storytelling into healing practice. And it can look several ways. So there's three main pillars, or I like to say domains of bibliotherapy. The first is receptive prescriptive bibliotherapy, and that's where a therapist might recommend a book to help with an emotional problem. You can do that by reading with the therapist in the counseling room, which is more like interactive. And you can do it by just getting a book recommendation from your therapist and reading it on your own personal time. And that's more prescriptive bibliotherapy. And then that way you can choose whether or not you want to have a discussion about it with your therapist, or if you've maybe made some connections or you've learned something new that you want to bring into the counseling room to process with your therapist. That's one way that could look. And then there's symbolic ceremonial bibliotherapy. So this is the way that we use books and stories and storytelling to really build ritual practices for ourselves. And that could look many different ways. Some therapists incorporate the use of like journaling or prompts such as, write a letter to your inner child, write a letter to someone who harmed you and then rip it up. right? Or burn it. So there's a lot of different ways that
Mm.
symbolic ceremonial bibliotherapy can look. And then there's expressive creative bibliotherapy. So this is the way that we connect to stories by using the expressive arts. And so this can look many different ways as well. For expressive creative, there's so much that you can do. And depending on the client, the age of the client, it can look different ways. JC Hall is a social worker here in the Bronx. He runs the hip hop therapy program at Mont Hall Community School. It's a second chance high school here in the Bronx. And he uses hip hop therapy in such a powerful way to help the young people that he supports, with their own, therapy goals, and they write their own hip hop songs and they perform them. And it's really cathartic, and it's a beautiful program. It's a beautiful program. I hope that one day I can go and hang out with them and just like get a sneak peek of how he does it. But that's one way that expressive creative bibliotherapy can look. And with little ones, I started off as a school social worker and early childhood social worker. So, working with the little ones around incorporating literature is like my favorite. And there's so many different ways that we can help little ones build meaningful connections to stories. So you can do, making collages, drawing representations of the stories, dramatic play, puppet shows. With the older kids, we would do a lot of role play. I would push into ELA classrooms and support the teachers in teaching, books from the curriculum. And we would make it bibliotherapeutic by asking the kids to dig a little bit deeper. Let's talk about what's really going on in the story. What's the conflict in the story, right? What is the decision that the protagonist is going to have to make? And what do y'all think about it? Can y'all relate? Have you guys ever been in a situation like the protagonist? No? Okay, let's do a role play. And kids would love stuff like that. And it was also a really great opportunity for me to show students who I am and what I do and earn their trust and earn their rapport on their terms and on their time, to get them out of the classroom and eventually into the counseling room. Because one thing about working with kids in the inner city, right? Like they see right through pretense and they're not, they got to feel you out. Like, what's this person really about? So I would come in, hey, I was like bright eyed, bushy tailed as a new school social worker, ready to do some good counseling. And my students were like, Miss, we are not going to the counseling room with you. Like, we don't even want to, go to counseling. We don't even know why that's on, whatever our IEP. And some kids don't even want their peers to know they have an IEP. So, yeah, those are some ideas of what it could look like across the three domains. But the great thing about these three is that depending on the therapist and depending on the client, you can get really creative with how you incorporate it into healing practice.
Nice. So as a woman of color, using a therapy modality that is maybe not considered mainstream, what has your experience been like? Do you feel like sometimes you don't get taken seriously, or do people say, oh wow, you're using that as a form of therapy? Like, what has that been like?
Yeah, so it's funny because when I started my social media presence, I did get feedback like that from a lot of my colleagues of like, "Oh, you're so brave to, come out as a bibliotherapist or to niche down this way." And for me, this is what I do. This is what I've always done, and this is how I've helped many of my clients, and it's how I've helped myself. Right. My grandmother passed away when I was 14. I went into foster care before legally emancipating myself at the age of 17. Put myself through college, through grad school. So like, I'm not someone who grew up with an easy life. And so like when I say books saved my life, I really mean that. And I think a lot of the criticism behind Books to Heal is this idea of intellectualizing. A lot of clinicians and just the way we're trained, right, is like there's sort of this idea of, well, if I niche down as a bibliotherapist, am I saying that that's enough? That you don't really need therapy, reading can be your therapy, because that's a big tagline in the book community. People who are self-proclaimed, avid readers, you see it all over social media. There's even like popular hashtags about it, like reading is my therapy. I don't need a therapist because I have my books, that kind of idea. And so I always preface anything that I post on my platform by saying, I am educating people on what bibliotherapy is and how I incorporate it as a therapist, but I'm not saying that reading is a replacement for therapy, right? Because the whole aspect of bibliotherapy is that books are a tool for you to develop trust and rapport with a therapist. You can't do good therapy unless you have that established therapeutic alliance. And I think for a lot of people, especially in today's society, we're so isolated from each other. We're so disconnected from ourselves and from each other that there's really a lot of people in the world who straight up struggle to relate, interpersonally relate to someone. I think there's a lot of folks who also struggle with this idea of coming to therapy and then like bearing it all with a stranger. I know for me, like working in the Bronx, like that's something I hear a lot from people. It's like, why do I have to pay a stranger, to tell you my problems? I could talk to a friend, I could talk to the pastor, and it's like, by niching down as a bibliotherapist, I've been able to get people to understand that books are a powerful tool to help us relate, not just for you to relate to me as your therapist, but for you to understand how the science of reading helps you heal, helps you see yourself more clearly. Because when we're reading, nobody's there with us judging us. Nobody's there saying, oh, you had that thought. That's a bad thought. That makes you bad, right? We can have a full spectrum of emotions. We can allow all sorts of thoughts, feelings, and desires to be brought into our conscious awareness without the shame or the, embarrassment of somebody else, like seeing it or hearing it and I think that there's therapeutic usefulness in that that's really, really powerful. We project a lot while we're reading. There are things that come into our conscious awareness and our inner world when we're reading that we probably wouldn't want to say out loud. But when you're reading with a therapist who's trained to help you make these deeper connections, to help you bring those unconscious feelings, thoughts, and fears, right? We can go on and on and on into your conscious awareness through the lens of fictional characters. Like it's actually a really useful and effective way to do therapy. So I always say the book is a tool. The therapy is really happening between the interaction you're having with the therapist, but the book is a tool to help facilitate that, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. What I wanted to ask, and I think that you bridged perfectly into this question, is how do you use books as an intervention to help your clients access their emotions and process difficult experiences?
Yeah. Well, for my clients who are avid readers anyway, this is a part of their daily practice anyway. They're always reading. And so I think folks who are avid readers tend to be people who are introspective anyway, who are really prone to self-reflection anyway. And so I tend to kind of like assess, one, what is the problem that my client is having? What is the goal? Or what are the goals of our therapy together? And then what is a book that I can recommend for our work together that's going to support them in meeting that goal? And sometimes it's a fictional book and sometimes it's nonfiction. I recommend across genres, but I always do a reading intake to really assess who my client is as a reader, because I want to prescribe the best book medicine possible that I think is going to elicit an emotional response. That's always the goal, is to recommend a book that is going to help my client feel something. I want you to feel something. Right? We're walking around life so disassociated, disconnected from ourselves, our most authentic selves, our most authentic feelings and needs, because we're just trying to pay the bills. We're just trying to make it to work. And we're overladen with grief. So many of us have so much unprocessed grief and things that we're holding that are not in our conscious awareness. So I'm always going to prescribe a book that's going to help my client see themselves more clearly, allow themselves to have an experience that's going to be emotionally cathartic. And then once we tap into that emotional catharsis and those feelings start to come from the unconscious and the preconscious into conscious awareness, now we got some meat for a really great therapeutic discussion. We can make some connections between what came up for you in your own life. And I think what makes fictional stories unique too is that when we're reading, authors who do this well, we're able to see the inner life of the protagonist before any conflict arises. So we have an intimate understanding of who this person is, what they want, what their insecurities are, what the barriers are, right, that they're going to have to face to deal with whatever challenge gets presented. And that's a really beautiful thing, because in connecting and attaching to fictional characters, we learn so much about ourselves and what we want and what we value, and maybe even mistakes that we've made that have had impacts in interpersonal relationships, or even in our own internalized, we can go on and on and on, internalized hatred, internalized shame, internalized anti-Blackness. Like, don't get me started on that. So there's just so much that the best book medicine prescribed at the right time can reveal to us about us.
So using book medicine, you help your clients to feel. How do you also help them to find understanding in literature?
Yeah, well, by attaching to fictional characters. I'm going to give you an example. So there's this book, right? This is like a very polarizing book in the book community, Luster by Raven Leliani, and she's from the Bronx. People either love this book or they hate it. And I think it's because the protagonist brings up a lot for people, especially Black women. This is a young Black woman who is really, she's just struggling, walking around life disassociated, loses her job, ends up having a fling with this married man in an open marriage, and building some kind of like strange friendship with his wife. And when I used this book in bibliotherapy, it's interesting because my clients have either like written this character off completely, like they just totally judge her and they can't stand her, and why are you making me read this book? And I always tell clients, well, if you judge her that harshly, knowing that she's got mental health issues and other things that are impacting the way she's abandoning herself, how much harsher do you judge yourself? Or even just trying to get a client to see, like, you really can't stand this character. It's really hard for you to tolerate seeing just how much she is self-abandoning and self-harming through her behavior, right? Can you think of a part of you, even if it's just a little sliver, a tiny part of you, that can relate to what it means to abandon yourself, or to need and seek out validation and love so much that you take that need to the wrong person or the wrong place? And sometimes if my client has the spoons for it and the emotional capacity, like a light bulb will go off, like, wow, yeah, I guess I can relate to this character more than I thought I could. Because books are mirrors. And whenever we have an intense emotional reaction when we're reading a fictional story, it's because we're attached, we're invested, and something is coming up for us. So I always like to use that as something to interpret for the client. There's something there. Because if it didn't matter to you, you wouldn't love her or hate her. You would just be indifferent. But whenever there's a strong, like, emotional response or reaction, I'm like, oh, there's something there. There's something there.
I have never thought of books or the attachment that happens because of your story that you're reading, the way that you just explained it. I mean, that makes so much sense. I can see now how you can refer to it as medicine and how you can help your clients, because as soon as it evokes an emotion, what is the emotion and why is the emotion? And now you're in therapy.
Exactly. Because we project every day. We do it to each other every day. Like, oh, I'm not jealous. She's jealous, right? And then it's like, but you're feeling something.
Right.
So another example, I had a mother I was doing, because I do parent coaching as well. And this mother's daughter had just been diagnosed with a disability. And so we were just like processing some of the things that she's going to have to do. Because, the minute your child is diagnosed, they slap you with a to-do list, hundreds of pages long, of all the early intervention you need and appointments and assessments. So we ended up reading True Biz by Sarah Novick. And I write about this in my upcoming book because it's such a powerful case example. And in this book, it's just like a mother who is trying to do her best by her daughter who has hearing loss. And she ends up, listening to the advice of all these medical professionals, and it really puts pressure on her relationship with her daughter. She's so caught up in, I got to do this because the doctors and the medical experts are telling me to do it, that she's not looking at how her anxiety and her need to appease her own internalized guilt as a mom is getting acted out in her relationship to her daughter. So when I first started coaching this parent, she was like, I guess we could read it, but I'm not going to relate to this mom because I would never put the opinion of medical professionals, over what I think and my husband thinks and my daughter knows she needs. But her daughter's really little and I could feel the grief, right? And so we read it and she came to session. I'll never forget the next day. She was like, girl, I cried and boo-hooed like a baby when I finished this book. So I'm like, okay, let's get into it. Like what made you cry? And she pulled a couple excerpts and we read them in the session together and we were processing it. And she said, wow, I was projecting that like this mother in the book was not dealing with her stuff and was, making all these choices that was affecting her daughter. But as I'm reading her story and I'm understanding her thought process, I realize that I'm doing this too. Maybe not in this way, but I do feel anxious about my child meeting their developmental milestones. I am overburdened by all of the things these medical professionals are telling me to do. I do feel a level of guilt over why my child has, special needs. Like, is it something that I did when I was pregnant? Is it? And she was like, I guess I was so overcome with just wanting to make sure that my child gets the therapies and everything that they need that I wasn't even sitting with myself as a mom to really process how all of this was affecting me. And by reading the story of this other mother's journey, I realized now that it's affecting me a lot. It's affecting me a lot. And we cried and we laughed but that's the power of emotional catharsis while reading, right? Like initially her stance was, I don't need to read. Like I already, I'm a good mom. I'm aware. I'm self-aware. I'm not acting nothing out on my daughter. I'm doing the work. I'm going to therapy. I'm working with you, Emely. Why? I don't have any issue around this need to fix my child. But then you read someone else's story, you can access language. You have a reference point to compare yourself to kind of see yourself more clearly. And maybe you don't have the same experience of the protagonist, but in journeying along with them, naturally, right, you're going to grow attached to a character, the story, an outcome. And all of those things reveals something about us and the human condition. That's the power of fiction when it's written well.
Wow, that was deep. I was going to ask you, how do you help your clients to do inner child work through books and literature? And I mean, I guess that was kind of an example. I don't know if she was able to connect with her inner child through that, but it brought out something that was a deficiency that she was able to address.
Yeah.
So how can you do this? How can you do this with inner child issues?
Yeah. Well, we did do a lot of really good inner child work because then we start talking about her and her mother, right? And how did her mother parent her? And how did that in turn inform, a lot of things? How she felt about becoming a mother, how the way she understands the role of a mother, her own guilt and internalized shame, right? Around like, oh my God, is it my fault that my child has, a disability? Helping her tease out like how much of that is her own internal voice and how much of that is the internalized voice of her own mother or maybe other important figures from her childhood. So I think it's all connected, right? Because when we think about the act of reading, it's really about tuning into our inner world. And all of those people are a part of our inner world, including our inner child. So there's no way that you could have a rich understanding of your inner world without giving your inner child the mic. And I think with reading, it's a beautiful thing because, and let's be honest, literacy trauma is very real. And bibliotherapy is a modality that I think, especially where reading is concerned, would only benefit those who are literate. Or who have the capacity and the desire for self-reflection. So there's like a certain client profile, that's optimal for this kind of modality. But the inner child piece is always there in my mind as a therapist. because there's even times like when I do bibliotherapy sessions for as like a support for people who are not my weekly clients, I curate a presentation for them based on their reading intake. And I forgot why I was bringing this up. We were talking about inner child.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and one of the things I always ask, I just remembered it again. And one of the things I always ask as we're going through the literature that I pulled for them, I'll say, do you want to read it or do you want me to read it? And it's always interesting. It gives me really good information on the client and their childhood, because for some people, they only want me to read. They want to be read to. It feels very nurturing. And it's almost like repairing something that they didn't get when they were little. Not every child had a home life or a home culture where they were being read to, by a caring adult, or where reading was something that was pleasure based. Usually it's performance driven. It's about like our academic life, and reading for pleasure for some people is like a newfound thing in adulthood. And it's a great way to repair those inner child wounds. And maybe you were told when you were little that you're not a strong reader, or you don't read fast enough, or maybe you were forced to read things that didn't interest you, that didn't reflect your reality. And so reading always felt like a chore. So I think like that's part of inner child healing too, is reclaiming a love of reading now as an adult. Like I love there's this brother, he's so dope, Oliver, I forget his last name, but he's on TikTok and Instagram, and he is a Black man living with OCD who was illiterate, and he talks about the trauma of growing up as a Black man in America who couldn't read, and now as an adult teaching himself to read. And he does this like very publicly. He even goes live like once a day, and he'll read from his car, and he's like stuttering through it and like stumbling through some words, but he's like persisting. And sometimes I'll just share like his videos with young people that I work with to be like, look at this brother over here. Like if he can do it, you can do it. And kids who I've shared him with really are like, wow, they're taken aback at the raw vulnerability of a Black man using his platform to share with us how he's reclaiming his love of reading, while dealing with mental health struggles and other things. And it's really like I'm getting choked up just talking about it, because I don't think he realized, or maybe he does realize, how powerful his presence on social media is. And for me as a bibliotherapist, seeing that, like, it's just so beautiful. It's really, really beautiful. So that's
I'm
all
gonna
part
say
of
that's
inner
gotta be
child
everything
healing.
for you. Mm. So something you mentioned earlier, and you said I can go on and on about this. I want to give you an opportunity to kind of touch on that. And this is also something that you do. What is racial healing, and how do you integrate racial trauma recovery into what you do?
Ooh, yes, let's talk about it. Racial healing is it's about honoring the history of our ancestors. It's about putting history in context and realizing that slavery really wasn't that long ago. Especially if you're Black American in a racialized body in this country, like it wasn't that long ago, and really understanding the after effects of what this means in our blood and our DNA, the ancestral trauma, the cultural legacy burdens that we carry. A lot of the work that I do, as well as a bibliotherapist, is about this, is about like reclaiming our ancestral traditions, our healing practices. Like for me, even as someone who was raised by my grandmother, and had to go to church with her 6 days a week, like I knew that my grandmother um, had spiritual gifts. Like I remember she had an altar, in our basement. She never wanted me to know that she had one, and she never talked to me about it, right? Because again, colonialism and white supremacy culture and all of that. But that's really what racial healing is about, is like understanding who we are, who our ancestors are, and that these methods, these self-healing practices, traditional storytelling, oral storytelling, like this is all in us. We've been doing this. Our ancestors did this to heal. This was how they coped and moved through their pain. And part of what white supremacy does is it divorces us from that. And it tells us that those things are bad, or those things are not inferior, right? That they're inferior and that we're inferior. And I think racial healing has to do with reclaiming those practices and really knowing the truth of who we are, who we've always been, how we've always healed. And I just love seeing more clinicians of color use their pen and use their platform to speak out about decolonizing therapy, decolonizing even just this idea of like psychotherapy and the therapist as the expert, because I never feel like I'm an expert. Every client I meet, it's a fresh slate. You're the expert on your own life. You have the knowledge in your bones of what you need to heal. And I'm just there as a witness. And I have a particular set of skills to help you through your healing practice. But you're the expert, not me. And I think that's all a part of racial healing. And for some, it's just acknowledging race in the room. Like, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the political. Let's talk about the fact that, like, what is it like to live a marginalized experience in a racialized body? How does that impact you? How did that impact your father? How did that impact your mother? How did it impact your grandparents? Some of us don't know. We were never told. Or we're afraid to ask, right? Because, like, especially in Black families, it's like, stay out of grown folk business. But now you're an adult and you're like, well, look, you know, like when my son was diagnosed with autism and his neurologist and I were talking, he's like, you know, looking at the family, do you think anybody else might be? And then he ran some tests on me and I was showing some signs that I'm neurodivergent, which I didn't know, but makes a lot of sense. And so in my mind, I'm thinking like, wow, now I'm looking at my father differently. And I'm thinking, wow, my father struggled with addiction his whole life. I wonder if there's something else going on there, right? That's all racial healing, because in the 60s, 70s, a little Black boy who showed any sort of challenge, were they rushing to get him assessed by a psychologist? No, they probably said he had behavioral issues and suspended him or kicked him out of school, or you know what I mean? So me saying now, Dad, my son is autistic. What do you think about that? Have you ever been tested, you know, for autism, or do you think that you have any kind of neurodivergence? Now we're opening a gateway and a portal to him thinking like, wow, maybe I wasn't just a bad kid. Maybe there was something else there. So I feel like that's all part of ancestral healing, racial healing, and reclamation as well.
I was just thinking about the illustration you gave of your dad. Like, if he was to think back and be able to see signs and be able to put a name to his behaviors or his experiences, that can do so much for him to have grace on himself.
Yep.
And
Self-compassion.
just to be able to, all of it. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that out.
You're welcome.
What are some ways that you use your platform as a therapist to give back to your community?
Yeah. Well, first of all, content creation is a lot of work. So I was talking, I'm like, look, I'm not doing this because it's making me money. I'm doing this because this is how social media is free marketing, and it's a great way to build community. Like my life is very busy. I'm a mother of 2 little ones. With my son, you know, being autistic, he needs a certain level of support from me. I'm on call all the time. And then I have my clients, and then I have my husband. You know, poor man, he got needs too, but it's just a lot of needs going around. So for me, I don't have, you know, I'm not somebody who's going to be able to do a bunch of speaking engagements every year, or to be seen in my community every day. Like, my life is the life of a homemaker, a mom, and a wife. That's the reality of it. And I'm very fortunate that because I established myself professionally before I had children, I can have a private practice. That's a privilege, because honestly, if I hadn't done that, I don't know where I would be professionally right now. And that's just the truth of being a woman in this society when you know, decide to become a mom. So for me, having a platform at all is a gift, a way that I consider I educate my community and love on them and share what I do, because I want social workers coming up now, counselors coming up now, to know bibliotherapy is a valid methodology. You can get trained as a bibliotherapist with the International Federation of Biblio and Poetry Therapy, the Therapeutic Writing Institute. There's many different paths you can take to becoming a creative arts therapist. So that's really what I want to do, is like provide psychoeducation. I'm not somebody who gatekeeps. I don't, I've had like people reach out to me who are colleagues on social, be like, hey, I'm interested in bibliotherapy. Like, do you have any advice? And I'm like, if I have the spoons and the time, or I can make the time, sure, let's hop on a Zoom call, because that's how we elevate the community. That's how we elevate each other. And support each other. And this is not about being the only one who does this. This is about showing how it's done and that it's possible. I also work with different organizations. So I've collaborated with Grace, which is a nonprofit organization here in New York City that provides free therapy to adolescents in the 5 boroughs. I work with Open Path Psychotherapy, which provides sliding scale, affordable therapy options to people who can't afford to pay at, a therapist's full rate. And so, yeah, that's some ways, and just really being like open and as accessible as I can be. I run a book club, and that community is like a smaller community that I've been able to build so that people who are interested in becoming librarians or bibliotherapists have access to me off of social media, so that I can share more of the technique and like the ins and outs of how to incorporate the use of literature into healing practice. And I love my book club. If you're in my book club and you're watching this right now, I love you. And just like being a resource, especially being in the Bronx and being someone who is, clinically trained. I'm always involved at local events at my library. If, I'm like doing social work from the library. If somebody needs an early intervention referral, let's do it. If you have some questions that I can be supportive, about in any way, like I'm always down to be supportive. I just love my people. We're so beautiful and we're so strong, and there's so much goodness in us. And I think, places like the hood gets valued because it's like, oh, especially in the Bronx, like I feel like it's a borough where people are like, they have a certain perception, but then you come here and you interact with people and you're like, wow, like there's so much strength in our community. And I just want to continue to add to that and amplify that and use whatever platform I have to speak to the beauty of who we are as a people and how that's reflected in good literature.
You're doing it. You are 100% doing it. Thank you for what you do.
Thank you.
Also, you have a book coming out, right?
I do.
Plug it.
Listen. Oh, it's different. It hits different when you're writing your own book. My book is coming out April 2025 with Row House Publishing. I'm so excited because I've been working on this manuscript for like 5 years, and I just couldn't find a publisher that was really in alignment with what I wanted for this book. I knew that I wanted to write a book on bibliotherapy to share, the techniques and the history, but I didn't want it to be a textbook. I wanted it to be accessible. So priced more at like the $20 range than the $50 range. And I knew that I wanted it to be something that was accessible in terms of, reading it. I didn't want it to be jargony or to be something that was like specifically written for therapists. I want anybody to be able to pick up this book and come away with an understanding of the science behind how reading helps us heal, how reading helps us build community, and how that fosters a really rich life, both our inner life and our outer life. And so, yeah, I'm working on it now, and it's a beautiful process. It's a stressful process because, again, I got the kids and a lot going on. They don't always let mommy write, but I'm up 4 a.m. trying to bang out these chapters. And it's been an emotional journey, to be honest with you. I went to the Schomburg recently to do some research in the archives, and it wasn't until I started teaching that I learned about Sadie Peterson Delaney, who is a Black woman librarian. First, she was a social worker, then she became a librarian, and she's known as the godmother of bibliotherapy. And for me, that was really powerful because as a Black woman myself doing this work, I had never seen her name in the literature. I think she's more widely recognized in librarian circles than like journals on therapy practice. But when I went to the Schomburg, I was able to like read through her archives. There's like even a letter that Countee Cullen wrote her thanking her for using his poetry in her treatment of war veterans. There was letters in there from like publishing houses thanking her for reviewing Black books and all that she's done to like amplify the work of diverse writers. She worked with the blind. She worked with disenfranchised youth. Like her body of work is so, I mean, talk about excellence. Talk about Black excellence. I was there. I just came to do a little research for my book. I ended up staying there for the whole day and literally making it through a box of tissue because that's how touched I was holding her letters in my hand and just like, and there's this one letter that her husband wrote her. And he's just letting her know, like, babe, I love you. You're amazing. Nobody might value the work that bibliotherapy takes, but you're showing people just how much books help people heal and in the Black community in particular and for Black veterans in particular. And I'm just sitting there bawling. I'm like taking my notes and the librarian's coming to check on me and she's like, you good? And I'm like, yeah. And it wasn't until after I left that she found me on Literacy NYC on Instagram and she added me and then she reached out and she's like, oh my God, I didn't realize that you're a bibliotherapist. Now I can see how that was a very spiritual, emotional journey for you to read through the Sadie Peterson Delaney archive. And, you know, she was so sweet. She's like, anything you need, I'm here. And she sent me the link to a few additional archives that I can access online for my book research. But man, it's moments like that where I'm reminded of just the power, you know, of our ancestors and the work that we did when we were denied access to so many things, especially, you know, when our ancestors were denied the ability to even learn how to read. So to be now, you know, present and reading this history and writing to it, it's a deep honor that I'm really grateful for and a bit overwhelming, but I try to be spirit led in all I do. So I hope that the book really just amplifies the work of Black librarians who contributed to the field and provides a resource for anybody who wants to train as a bibliotherapist moving forward. I'm really excited about this book.
I can't wait for it.
Thank you.
All right, last question. If you could use your platform to encourage anyone who may be struggling with their mental health or their big feelings or emotions, what would you say to them and how would you help them through literature?
Yeah. I would say to them, you're doing better than you feel. That feeling is a gift. Sometimes we are overwhelmed by the intensity of our emotions because it feels like we're weak for feeling things so strongly. But in a world that would rather that we be disconnected from our emotions, feeling deeply is a strength. And to honor that, to protect that, to be very careful who you bring that to. Not everybody is deserving of the most vulnerable part of you. There are many scary things about the world, but there's also so much beauty in the world and lots of good people in the world too. And so before we get caught up in that negative thought spiral that, you know, the world is a dangerous place and people are mean or ugly or all the threats, right, looming outside our doors, just to know that, like, if you're feeling, that means that you're living. That means that you're human. And it's a gift to be able to have access to those feelings. Feelings are information, and that's all that they are. It's what you do with those feelings that counts. And how would I help that person with the use of literature? I would say that you can always find respite, joy, pleasure, solace, and play in books, and to get really curious about yourself as a reader. And if you struggle to re-enter or enter the joy behind reading, then start small. Start small. Go back to what was the first book you read in kindergarten, first grade that you remember that made you laugh? Go pick that book up. Go borrow it from the library. Tap into the source of your joy in regards to reading, and start there.
Thanks. That was so good. This whole thing has been so good. Thank you
Thank
for this.
you. I'm honored to have been invited. It's so funny that that last question, because I just bought myself a copy of Tommy D. Piola's Stregonona, and oh man, I bought it to read with my kids, but it unlocked all these memories. Like, my first grade teacher introduced me to that book, and she's really the person who cultivated my love for reading. She was the first teacher to sign me up for a library card. She was the first teacher to make stories fun in her classroom. Like, she would have us dress up. We just had so much fun with Miss Parkins. And after buying that book and unlocking all these memories, I ended up I was up for 4 hours at night, and I ended up writing a whole segment of my book dedicated to her and the use of books in developmental bibliotherapy with kids. So that's I'm going through my own, I guess, inner child revisitation writing this book, and that's been really exciting too.
That's awesome. If people want to find you online or on social media to stay in contact with you or follow your content, where can they find you?
At Litterapy, L-I-T, let me make sure I'm spelling it right, Litterapy _. So Litterapy _NYC. And I'm on TikTok, I'm on Facebook, on Instagram, on Threads now. And, you can find me on LinkedIn. And I also have a website, www.litterapynyc.com, and my book club that, folks can always join. And it's a subscription-based book club, so you can subscribe or unsubscribe at any time. And I'll be releasing deets soon about my book launch. I think I have to set up a book website to get pre-orders in and stuff like that. So I'll be sharing that probably with my book club first, so that they can get first dibs on any advanced readers copies, and then I'll share on my socials as soon as Real House Publishing gets that started for me.
Nice. That's so awesome. I'm so excited for you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you for your support and for rocking with Bibliotherapy. It's nothing like, hearing a brother just amplify my work. So I'm deeply appreciative of that as well.
I'm happy to. 100%. All right, Emely, thank you so much for this. Thank you for your time. Thank you for doing this with me. Thank you for the work that you do, for who you are, for what you do, and how you do it.
Thank you.